My name is Sabrina Charney Hull. I'm the Director of Planning for the town. I'm here today to help kick off the rezoning of the Chappaqua Hamlet. And you've all come out today, and I thank you for spending your afternoon with us. You're here today to discuss a form-based code for Chappaqua. And just to give you some background, in 2014, we did a tremendous amount of community outreach where we spoke to some of you, we spoke to your neighbors, and we spoke to other residents in the community, and we asked you what you liked about the community, what you didn't like about the community, and how should we change things. We're here today to talk about how we are changing things based on what you told us you wanted to do. I'm going to back up a little bit and just real quickly show you this book. In this book, this is the guidelines. These are the codes that regulate how we live in the community. It addresses your homes, the zoning within which your homes stand, where your house is built in relation to your neighbor's house. It regulates what type of business you have in your building, if you own property or if you operate commercial property. We're here today to discuss taking a portion of this code and changing it. This means that we will talk about new regulations, new types of building structures, new types of uses, the heights of buildings, what the streetscape should look like. Our goal today is to introduce you to a means of creating a code that creates community. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kimley Horn and Tortogales, who the town has hired to help us through this process, and they're going to tell you what it's all about over the next hour, and then you're going to go around and you're going to look at different drawings and give us some feedback. Again, we're asking you to tell us what you think so we know what to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie Von Olson from Kimley Horn.
And you're going to flip the slides. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. The room really did fill up. I'm happy to see that. How's this? Better. Okay. My name is Bonnie Von Olson. I'm with Kimley Horn. We have another slide with introductions, so I can go through that in a minute. But the agenda for this afternoon, as Sabrina said, we're going to have a presentation first, and then we're going to break into smaller groups, and you can ask questions and get into a little more detail if you're interested in the topics that you're interested in. We're going to discuss why we are here, the team and the process, and what is a form-based code, an all-important question, and why. We're going to do a summary of the analysis that we've done so far. We started this process in May, and now we're into July. And the recommendations that have been coming up, we've been coming up with working with the Downtown Working Group, and then discuss the visualizations that we've come up that take the maps and the regulations and turn them into ideas and actual forms. So why are we here? As Sabrina said, you put a lot of work into your comprehensive plan. You came up with some very specific visions and goals. And in this case, we're talking about the Chappaqua Hamlet specifically, and how these specific portions of the comp plan relate to the Chappaqua Hamlet. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the comp plan, the livable built environment, harmony with nature, resilient economy, healthy community, and responsible regionalisms are the primary sections of the comp plan. And I'm not going to read all of that, but we will be posting this online so you can read it at a later date. So the meeting objectives for this particular meeting, as I said, we've been meeting since May with the Downtown Working Group, but this is in order to update the public on what we have been doing and to gather input. So we'll inform the community about our process and our progress. We'll review the recommendations for the form-based code and the regulating plan, which is the new piece of the chapter of the code that Sabrina referenced. We'll review recommendations for parking ratios and standards, and collect your community input. So the team, as I mentioned, there's a Downtown Working Group, which is composed of the town board, a few planning board members, a few residents, and various other people with various expertise that have been chosen, so we get a diverse group and we get some input from all different angles. And the consultant team, I'll introduce who's here today anyway. For Kimley Horns, myself, I'm a planner and landscape architect, and I'll be conducting the seeker process after the draft of the actual code is developed. John Canning from Kimley Horn handles traffic. We have 3 of our interns here in the back row as well that are working with us for the summer. Eric Alestia with Tortigalis, and there's Tim Zork. The folks that are not here today, Joel Russell is our land use attorney who has an expertise in form-based codes in New York State specifically, so he can make sure that he's covering the legal aspects of all of this. Patty Adele and Bruce Murray are with the Real Estate Solutions Group, and they've been providing us with market input and some real estate analysis into the program. So basically, this is the process we're going to go through. Your comprehensive plan has your vision in words, and the purpose here is to discuss and come up with a form-based code that meets your vision for Chappaqua. And the portions of that code are the transect map, the regulating plan, the development standards, visualization, and the market scan, which is what Res Group put together. Then there will be a build-out analysis, which takes that code and applies it to the specific area, and that's going to be what the seeker process is based on in terms of you need a proposed action to evaluate. And then after the impact analysis, the code will be formally, introduced and adopted by the town board if that's, be revised during the process, but that's the final end objective. Is that it? So just to get in a few more specifics of it, basically we started with the review and analysis stage in May. We're now in the public design process with a couple of work sessions we've had with the downtown working group and now with you in the public meeting. That's the STAR. So we're really at the very beginning. Then after this, we'll get your input. Will be the formal drafting of the code, the refining of the code. Then that code will be evaluated for potential environmental impacts, which will then lead to eventually the accepted environmental impact statement and a finding statement and adoption of the code. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Hi, how is everybody? Good. So we're going to talk about what a form-based code is. By a show of hands, who knows what a form-based code is? That's a pretty good number, but there's a number of people that don't. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly. It's okay, and I say that because this will be up on the website, so there'll be time to kind of go through and look at it in more detail. You'll also have time to talk to us after the presentation. We'll be at 3 different stations, so we can answer any of your questions, but this will give you a kind of overview of what we're talking about. So when we look at a code, a zoning code, we look at this, a DNA is kind of a simple set of instructions. Some people might argue that this is not that simple, but it's in essence a set of instructions and rules, and that kind of plays out. So codes really have become kind of the DNA of our cities and of our towns and of our hamlets. There's a set of regulations, and so that set of regulations can result in this, or that set of regulations can result in this. And it all depends on what those regulations are. Sometimes somebody comes in and they say, oh, I'd love to do this kind of a project. And the answer might be, well, you can't because that's not allowed. So it's a pretty important document. And one of the concepts behind a form-based code is the idea of a transect. And what this really means is that you think of it through character areas. So when you look at a place and you look at these images on the top of the slide, you sort of look at it and you say, well, these must be like national parks, right? There's a certain character to them. In another area that you might call the rural zone, we all recognize it for being rural because the buildings are set way far back. There's a big lawn. You might not have curbs. You have a kind of a swale on the side of the road. And so it's a lot of kind of very physical criteria that sort of lets you know what the character of the place is and where you are. So the form-based code really starts by saying, in order to create a code, in order to know what it is that we want to produce with that DNA, we have to start by knowing what the character is that we're shooting for. And so that's what the part of this process is. So this is just really quickly, this is what we call suburban. There might not be sidewalks. The homes get a little closer than in a rural area. But when you get to kind of a general urban zone, this is what we call sometimes a T4. This is kind of what most people think of when they think of kind of the quintessential American small town, is kind of this character. You get a little bit more dense, T5, the buildings get closer, it may be paved from the curb to the building face, there's more commercial, buildings get a little taller, and then you have T6, which is the most urban kind of place that you get to. And then of course there's certain places that don't fit into this, things like university campuses and oil refineries and airports and things like that. So I'm going to go through these particular elements really quickly. So what happens with the form-based code is that you actually start with a framework. In other words, you set out and you say, where are the streets, where are the blocks, and where are the open spaces? And that becomes kind of the armature from which everything hangs. We're going to zoom into this block here. And so what the regulations do is they say, yes, use matters, but it's less important than the physical form. And so what happens is that we set up a build to line that sort of says on the face of this block, this is where you will build the buildings up to. It really focuses on things like how tall are those buildings? What percentage of that face of the block has buildings and how much of it is open? How much of it has gaps? It's really not focused on what kind of buildings are they? Are they rental or are they ownership? In the end, it doesn't really matter because the pedestrian experience from the sidewalk is what you see here. So then if we zoom back out, it can also look at big picture things like street trees. It can even look at specific building elements within the town or neighborhood. And then you put all of that together and you get this kind of a place. One of the things, for example, one of the rules often in form-based codes is that the parking can't be out in front of the building. So why a form-based code? A well-crafted form-based code is the most effective and predictable form of regulation resulting in pedestrian-scaled urban and mixed-use places. So if I came to you with these two images and I said to you, I want to build this next to your house, most people would probably react to that and say, I'm not really crazy about that. But if somebody came and said, oh, we'd like to build this near your house, you might say, oh, that looks like something I might be interested in. So one of the things that we understand is that how you put things together matters, certainly from an aesthetic perspective, right? But if it's really just aesthetics, is it that important? In reality, recent studies show that form influences behavior and that this can produce significant increases in health. There's a lot of research that shows that it can promote environmental sustainability, reducing a carbon footprint. Also promoting economic sustainability and fiscal responsibility. So the reason that form is important isn't just aesthetics. It really has to do with health, it has to do with the environment, it has to do with economics. So when we started this process, we started by looking at the history. It was something we always do in a community. This community has a rich history, and so we really have to understand what that is to know what a place is about. So here are just some images of that. This is an intersection you may recognize. This is actually Greeley going left to right and King going this way. And so you see that's interesting when you kind of go back in time at this corner. Right now, there are one-story buildings, but when you go way back, there were actually three-story buildings. So things have kind of changed over time. You do see a number of the older buildings were siding. There were masonry buildings. There were some taller buildings as well. This one is kind of a four or five-story. We were looking at one of the historic photos in the back. We actually found a four-story back there, which is interesting. And then, of course, the train station, which is kind of a Craftsman Adirondack kind of style. But when we looked at this, we looked at a map. The area that we're looking at here is this area and this area at the top of King. And so when we look at that, we have the Greeley House within the area. We have the church down here, and we also have the train station. One of the very interesting things about the train station is that it's actually was dedicated, was conveyed over to the town, but with certain restrictions. And some of those restrictions said that this park space had to be there and be maintained there. So when we look at 1893, what's really interesting is that there was no bridge, right, there on Quaker. King Street actually went across the tracks, and that's actually why you found commercial there, because it was really kind of the main street that came across the tracks. However, the train station used to be up here, further to the north. And then over time, what happened is that the train station moved south. There was a bridge built. And so that really kind of changed the dynamic of the place. What's interesting in this historical map is that the intention was always that since Main Street got cut off, then King Street actually turned and went south and connected to the train station. So it was really trying to bring everything together. And what's interesting there is that you see what's currently today in parking lots was actually originally platted with streets and blocks and lots. So the intention was always that this sort of would become the downtown of the hamlet, and it would join together with the train station. So when we look at some other issues, assets and issues here, some of the key issues that we find is that there are significant residential restrictions. Either you can't have it on the ground floor. There are different zoning designations here. Some of them actually don't. In particular, kind of the southern area doesn't allow residential. The civic elements are disconnected, meaning that if I'm at the train station, I kind of got to go through a parking lot to get to the rest of the hamlet. If I'm down at Town Hall where we are today, it's a little more distant, right? I have to go walking through there. So then there are also large parking lots, which kind of become the image when you get off the train. That's what you see. Area limitations, meaning that you're kind of hemmed in by the train tracks. You're hemmed in by single-family homes and some topography. And so it's not a huge land area. But there are also, the lots themselves tend to be smaller lots and shallow lots. So now we're going to get into what our zoning recommendations are. And these are really built around trying to help you meet your comp plan goals. And so when we go through that, we look at the existing framework that I just mentioned that seems kind of disconnected. So the yellow arrow here represents Greeley, and this is King going up the hill up to the top of King. So you have the train station and the Memorial Park. You have the library and the town hall. You have the baseball field, but they're kind of disconnected. So the proposed framework is really to strengthen these connections. It's really about how do we connect A to the train station in a more meaningful way? How do we make that connect over to Greeley? How do you, in essence, bring the town hall and the library and the ball field into the mix? And how do you strengthen that all together? So when we looked at that, we sort of said there are two different kind of primary character areas. There's the area that's the lower area, closest to the train station. This is the place where we recommend that we use best transit-oriented development planning practices. This means greater density near the train station. It's also close to the civic uses, and this is a place that's more appropriate for taller buildings and for additional commercial space such as retail. When you go up the hill, and you're going up the hill up to Upper King, it's further from the transit station. It's also a hill. We recommend that buildings not be as tall, and there's a consideration for the adjacency to the single-family houses that are right up next to them, which is different from the area at the bottom where you're not really up against single-family houses, you're really up against other commercial or up against the tracks. This is just an existing zoning map. These are the zones that are there today. And so really it's about taking these and transferring them into the kind of a form-based code districts that are more appropriate. One of the things that I should point out, there's a blue line here. You'll see that these lands are the public lands. These are the ones that are owned by the town that have the parking lots and have the crescent green. It's red, it's zoned retail business, and it's also zoned planned industrial. And so what we're proposing here is zoning that goes over this. It's more in keeping with form-based code. However, we're not saying that these things are going to happen. These are really things that are still up to the town and the community. So when we looked at that transect earlier on, we sort of adapt this to this location. And we say, well, Mount Kisco is kind of the T6 of the town of Newcastle. So when we look at Lower King and we look at Upper King, we're sort of saying Lower King by the train station really is something like the T5 character, and the remainder of the area is really Hill, and Upper King is more like the T4 area, kind of the quintessential kind of American town. So now we're going to go through some maps, a lot of colors. These are things that are probably better, easier understood with a little time looking at them, but I'll go through some of the key elements here. So for the land use, we're recommending that residential be permitted anywhere, that there be no restrictions in terms of what type, meaning whether it's rental or ownership, condo, fee simple, and that it will be sort of more dense near the station. Affordable housing would have the same requirement that exists today in the zoning code. Mixed use and single use would be permitted, meaning retail and other office and commercial would be permitted throughout, with the exception of one area, which is down here to the south, which is something that's kind of more removed from the train station and from the existing King and Greeley area. So that's something that we think would just kind of detract from the kind of success of that area. This map is just a little different than the last one, a little hard to see, but there are some red lines here at the intersection of King and Greeley, here around the train station and connecting to Greeley. So what that means is that these are areas that we were proposing that would be required to have retail on the ground floor or other similar commercial uses. All of the other areas, it's permitted. It's just not required. And so the reason for that we're requiring that is because you want to maintain the commercial that's there today, and you want to have it compact, because that tends to be how retail, especially in a walkable kind of urban environment, tends to be more successful that way. So when we look at building heights then, the darkest blue is the tallest. We're proposing that you could have up to 5 stories right next to the train station. As you move away from the train station over, for example, a Greeley and King to the north and to the south on Greeley, that would be a maximum of 4 stories. And then lastly, going up the hill and as a transition to the single-family houses to the south, that there would be a maximum of 3-story height. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is really about what's the character from the curb to the face of the building. And so really what we've established here are that there are 3 kind of different character areas. So you have what's being built today. The improvements today, you're getting wider sidewalks, which is a great thing. But it's really paved from the curb to the building face. So this is really most appropriate in commercial areas, for example. Number 2, it's similar in that it's paved from curb to property line, but then from the property line to the building, it's actually softscape, right? So it's grass or shrubs or that kind of a thing. So as you get further away from the center, that's what's recommended, and the buildings get further back. And then the last one is what we call a verge or a tree planting strip, that rather than trees and tree pits, there's a green strip, the trees exist in there, behind the property line, the buildings are set back, and it's kind of a softscape from there to the building. Another concept is frontage occupancy. I talked about that a moment ago. That's really about how much building is there on the face of a block. So here are 3 images. This is high. This is Greenwich, Connecticut. You see on this block, it's just solid buildings with no gaps. Medium high, again, buildings but with gaps. And then medium, you start to see more gaps and smaller buildings. So really what happens, what's recommended here is that close to the train station, the frontage occupancy is high. As you get further away, it goes medium high. As you go up the hill and further to the south, it becomes medium. Open space. So in reality, open space, there are some new open spaces being built at the intersection of King and Greeley or thereabouts. Those, of course, are represented here. We are making a specific recommendation that the Crescent Green, the historic green, actually be enlarged. This is for a couple of reasons. One, because the original intention when the land was conveyed was actually that it was a bigger green space. And B, I think it would provide an opportunity for some of the events that happen here to happen in kind of a more comfortable kind of a space where you can have more activities. We're also recommending down basically right outside where we are right now to the right over here, is that there would be a green out here in front of the building. When you come from the south, it would just give you a better sense of kind of arrival and kind of a civic space and a flexible space there. So again, these are things that we're recommending, but again, would still need to be approved by the town and the town board. So throughout, what we're recommending is that small lots not have an open space requirement. So for example, if you have like 100 by 50 foot lot, you not be required to provide open space on there. But if you have a lot that's of a certain size, it's larger, that there actually be a requirement to provide open space, either on the property or payment in lieu of that for implementation of other open space by the town. Again, these are would go in the regulating plan. We're making a recommendation for an A.H. Smith Memorial Park, that this be enlarged, that it have things like interactive water features, places to sit, activated with uses around the space, and becomes a new kind of arrival front door. At the Civic Green, it would be more kind of a lawn space. This is actually a project that we did in Florida. What's interesting about this is in front of City Hall is that they actually have weddings out there. There's kind of a grove of trees, and it's a really nice space. And so it becomes something that's used certainly for a kind of a figural kind of thing, but also it's a functional space. So you can have a really great plan, and then you have really bad architecture, and it just doesn't kind of get there all the way, right? And so this would also have regulations for architecture. If you were to have a long building, what we've done is we've recommended that that building look like it's broken up into smaller buildings. So it's something that better fits in with the character of a neighborhood. Here are a couple of examples of that. This is a building that is 384 feet long, which is pretty long. The longest section of it is 112 feet, so it kind of looks like multiple pieces and breaks down the scale. This building on the right, while it's all sort of one building and one motif and brick, it has a requirement for courtyards in between. So rather than kind of a solid wall, you can require that you get some articulation, and it breaks it down and makes it feel more like a human pedestrian scale. For architectural style, there are many Hudson River Valley styles. There's existing Chappaqua styles. And so what we are recommending, given the history and given what's here today, is that the architectural styles that we recommend are colonial revival, Tudor revival, Italianate, Art Deco, Adirondack Craftsman, and classical. These are all things that actually exist here today. What we would say is that there's limited use of contemporary buildings. Contemporary buildings can be very nice, but they're also very challenging to do well. So what we're saying is they would be appropriate for things like civic buildings. Collegiate Gothic would really only be appropriate for a civic building. But there'd be a mix of masonry, meaning brick and stone, and clapboard or siding. And one of the things that you find in the historical buildings is you get porches, especially on the smaller buildings. And so we think that that's something that is an element that would be good to have, whether it's on a small building or even a larger building, these kinds of elements. So now we go to visualization. So what does all this mean, right? Because you look at a bunch of maps and you say, okay, but what is that? So one of the things that's required in the seeker process is that we sort of study what would happen if you were to build this out, right? In reality, it's probably not going to all happen, but let's study it anyway. So what we did is we said, let's take that and let's kind of do a theoretical build out. And this is, again, this is kind of like, oh, I decided, you know, a bunch of people got together, they put their properties together, and they structured some deal, and they built a bunch of things. So again, it assumes redevelopment of most parcels and structured parking where it's feasible, and redevelopment of all the parcels is unlikely. So what this shows is 1,460 dwelling units, which is a good number of dwelling units. It's enough that you get enough people that it really starts to support several small shops here. One of the things that we heard was that there was a potential desire for a kind of physical fitness or a wellness center. Again, we're not saying that's going to happen, but we're saying we should go ahead and study it so that if you do decide to do that, it's something that we've now facilitated through the seeker process. Also, a potential new town hall. we've accounted for that as well. So when you do this, what does that mean? What does it look like? So here we are. This is a kind of very simple model that looks at, this is Greeley. This is King right here. This is the bridge at Quaker. This is the historic train station. This is the area of the town hall where we are today. So we're in the north and we're looking south. So if you were to apply this code and the set of standards that we're recommending, and all of it got developed or redeveloped, this is what you would get. You can see as you kind of go up the hill, there's an opportunity for development there, but again, it starts to sort of get broken down as you go up the hill. Here we are, we're actually looking from the east, looking west towards the tracks. So what we have here in the foreground is Upper King. Then there's a kind of gap where you have the small buildings, and then you have the train station here, the bridge here, Greeley and King here, the baseball field here. In this scenario, this would be a parking garage to replace all of the transit parking, so that would free up land that's available there. So I think this gives you kind of a sense of what that would be. But again, it still doesn't sort of tell you, if I'm on the sidewalk, what does it really look like? And so that's what we have next. So let me go back real quick. So we're here, this view is taken from this model and then illustrated by an illustrator. So we're actually standing almost at the intersection of King and Greeley, and we're looking north and looking west across the street. So that's that view. So here we are standing on the sidewalk. These are your new sidewalks. This is about 16 feet. And what we're recommending, these are the kind of maximum standards, 4 stories maximum, but with regulations that require things like courtyards that kind of break that up. This next one, this is standing at the historic train station. That's what this is right here on the left. This is actually one of the columns of that train station. This is the memorial. This is the crescent green. That green is probably about that big today. And so it looks at expanding and making that larger to accommodate multiple different uses. This is 5 stories, although the 5th is kind of in a roof. And so that's certainly something that we would recommend also in the code, that if you were going to have tall buildings, that the top floor be made to look like it was more kind of in the roof. And so it brings the kind of scale down. Now we're going to look at parking. How many people get excited about parking? You do? Okay, that's great. I actually like to tell people that a lot of what we do is really about parking, because in the end, without it, you really can't get other things done.
Thank you, Eric. So my name is John Canning, and sadly, I'm the parking expert. I know how much you all love parking and standing on Greeley and looking in at the acres of parking you have down there by the train station. So our goal from a development perspective is that mostly you shouldn't see parking. It should be screened. You can put it in behind the buildings and wrap them, or if you have smaller buildings, especially if they're on a hillside, you can build them in underneath the buildings and put a front up. Next slide, please, Eric. You can see in the top right how some of those structures have parking wrapped inside the structures. And then on the bottom, what you see from the street, you don't see parking at all. Next slide. But parking is important on the street for a number of reasons. One, it encourages people to go and shop. We all want to say, oh, I want this, I'm going to go down for ice cream, and I'm going to find a parking space right in front, and I'm going to enjoy my ice cream. And then I get there, and there's never a parking space in front, but I'm already there. It also provides a buffer between pedestrian activity on the sidewalk and the street. And in addition, it slows traffic down, because if you don't have parking and just have a curb, people kind of fly through. If there's a potential that somebody's going to open a door, somebody's going to cross between cars, people tend to drive a little slower. So there's still on-street parking to activate the street and to calm the street. And thinking about Chappaqua, it's a TOD environment, but it's not perhaps as TOD as Mount Kisco is, because Mount Kisco has slightly more development. It is an ex-urban train station. There will be reduced car ownership if you live near the station, because you won't have to own 2 cars in a household. You could own 1 and you could take the train to work. But it will still be somewhat largely a car-dependent community, because when you do want to go to the grocery store, or you want to drop your kids at school or something like that, you'll probably want to have a car. So many households will have 1 car. Those who do have a car will probably leave it in Chappaqua when they go to work. So that means that it's kind of in conflict with the parking that you have at the train station already, because if there's cars parked there during the day for commutation, you can't park there as a resident. A couple of other things that we're trying to accommodate in the plan, in the form-based code, is to encourage sustainability. So if you provide more parking, you'll have more cars. If you provide less parking, you'll have less cars. What's the right number? Also, if you provide more parking, your buildings are going to be more expensive, because parking is very expensive. If you provide less parking, you will have slightly more affordable buildings. So we're trying to balance that between what you need and what's sustainable and what's affordable. So we have, as part of this process, we've come up with parking recommendations which show a credit for transit availability and the ability to have customers who live near you and stuff like that. But we also have recommendations for a toolbox. Some of these tools are already in your code, but some of them we recommend you consider adding to it, because basically what you want to do, you're required by the code to have a certain number of parking spaces, let's say 100. And let's say you have a residential building in the downtown area. When do you need those 100 spaces? Typically you need them overnight. And overnight your businesses are closed and your commuter parking lot is empty. So you could conceivably use some of that vacant parking space overnight, but you don't have anything in your code right now that allows you to do that. So we're recommending certain measures that would encourage you to do that and get to your 100 parking spaces required. Some of those measures, for example, are tandem parking. So where you have residential development, or even where you have a small retail building or a small office building, you can count on the fact that the people that live there could, if they chose to live there or work there, shuffle their cars in and out. I can park first and my partner can park behind me, and then we can argue over who left the keys where when one of us wants to leave. But it's more efficient and you can get more parking, you can get more use out of your downtown. It's more sustainable and it's more walkable. Shared parking, which as I mentioned before, you could have a provision in the code that would allow proposed developments to share parking between uses, even between the commuter lots if they had an overnight parking demand that was available. Satellite parking, if you don't own parking right on your property, but there's parking within a certain distance. I believe it's in your code now for 250 feet. We're proposing that you expand that to 300 feet, or maybe 500 feet if you provide a shuttle service. Stacker parking and automated parking, we're looking a little bit to the future. Automated parking is basically where you drive in and it's like the automatic for food long ago, where you put your money in and you press B1 and a sandwich appears out of nowhere. So you'll go in and you'll press B1 and your car will disappear to nowhere, and then it will come back when you come back. As long as they're not visible from the street and they're more sustainable, we think that they should be encouraged. Valet parking, we believe that you should be allowed to use that to count towards your parking spaces. So if I own a restaurant near, let's say, the commuter parking lot, I can take advantage of both the commuter parking lot and valet. I can have a valet service on the street with a license with the village. I pay the town, and then my restaurant parking, a portion of my restaurant parking in the evening can be accommodated in the commuter lot. There's a couple of others that I wanted to mention. One of them was overnight parking. So you have a provision in this town that there is no overnight on-street parking between, I'm going to say, November 1st and March 31st. And that's great for street cleaning and it's very efficient, but it's terrible for parking in the downtown area. Where I live, we have that same provision, but in the downtown area where I live, it's excluded. And so the way it works is we park on the street, it snows heavily, and then we're required to move our cars by 9 o'clock the next day. We get out, we all dig, and DPW comes and moves through. But we get to use our parking spaces every night of the year, except for when it snows, when we have to get up the next day and move them. The key to that is to make sure that you have enough width so that when your cars are parked and it snows, you still have the width that you need to get emergency vehicles through. So it's on a case-by-case basis, but we're suggesting that certain streets in the downtown area, and I expect that Greeley will be one of them, could be excluded from that overnight parking requirement. And the final one is ride-hail use. So we've all heard about Uber and Lyft and how people don't have cars anymore. And certainly to me, it seems that that is the way of the future. So if you have a lot of ride-hail activity, and if you can demonstrate it to the town, then you could take a credit on the amount of parking you're required to have. Although we are suggesting that to offset that, you provide a curbside area that will be able to accommodate all of this drop-off and pickup activity that will be occurring instead of parking. So overall, the goal is to have a code that requires parking based on need, that encourages affordability, encourages sustainability, and to have tools in the toolbox so that you don't have to straight up park all of your required parking on your property. You can take advantage of other opportunities, underutilized parking spaces that are nearby, provided that you have the agreements with the parties that might be needed for that. So that's basically the parking component of the plan. These are just some of the numbers. To an extent, they're based on what's in your code. We have, if you look for studios, smaller studios have a slightly less parking requirement. We're trying to encourage smaller, more sustainable, more affordable. We also have a slight credit for those that are closer to the train station versus those that are up at the top of King Street, because we believe that those are more walkable spaces that people there are likely to own, on aggregate, slightly fewer cars. And so we've made some similar recommendations for, the next slide please, for owned units versus rental units. It's my experience that if you're lucky enough to be able to afford a house, sometimes you're lucky enough to be able to afford an extra car. And on the next slide, Eric, we have some recommendations. Small businesses, we're giving small businesses a slight break on the parking requirement because that encourages small businesses. We know that there are a lot of small businesses in the community here, that it's difficult for them to survive, and we want to encourage that to the greatest extent possible. And it's the same both for retail or for professional office. So this is retail. And then restaurant, actually, there's not really much of a change in our recommendations for restaurants. Restaurants are an interesting animal because usually they're in the evening. They do have quite a high parking demand, but they tend to take advantage of valet parking quite a lot. So we'd like to see that your code is reflective of that and allows you to encourage restaurants to the limit that it doesn't impact its neighbors, but you want to be able to encourage them to flourish where you can. I think that's it for parking. Yeah. It is. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I was joking about the parking earlier, but the one thing that I would say is that a lot of times when communities are looking to kind of attract more residential or more commercial, the limiting factor is the parking. And so really trying to come up with solutions and strategies that help you to do that really becomes the key to unlocking many of the things that communities are looking for. So right now what we're going to do is we're moving to the open house portion of the meeting. And so what we're going to do is we have 3 stations. We have one over here to my right, which talks about things like building height and frontage occupancy and visual impact. We have over here on the left, to my left, is going to talk about parking. And the back is going to sort of talk about the remainder of the things that we presented here today. So feel free to come to any of these. We'll have multiple people at the stations. We also have white notepads because we're going to be writing down and taking your comments. Also, please be aware that this presentation is going to be posted on the website. So there's another opportunity for you to provide comments. And then as Bonnie kind of went through this entire process, there'll be other points where additional comments will be taken in as well and taken into account. So I invite you to kind of break out to these groups.